Buongiorno e benvenuti su Liberi Oltre le Illusioni. Io sono Fabio Enrico Traverso e oggi intervisterò Laurence Vardaxoglu, uno studente di dottorato all'Università Sorbona di Parigi e direttore di ricerca al gruppo di consulenza Verian, precedentemente Kantar Public. Laurence studia l'impatto della disinformazione sull'opinione pubblica e sui comportamenti, utilizzando metodologie sperimentali e sondaggi. Si è recentemente concentrato sulle elezioni francesi del 2022, però è un esperto anche in generale del mondo delle fake news e della disinformazione. Oggi con Laurence parleremo in particolare di cosa siano le fake news, quale sia la differenza tra le fake news e la disinformazione e quale impatto questi possano avere sui processi politici e sull'opinione pubblica. La puntata sarà in inglese e quindi buon ascolto. Hello everyone and welcome to this talk with Laurence Vardaxoglu, who joins us today to discuss the role of fake news and also to discuss what actually are labeled as fake news and how relevant they are to our current society and debate. So welcome, Laurence, and tell us a bit more about yourself.
Thanks, Fabio. So I'm currently finishing a PhD at the Sorbonne in Paris and the Paris School of Economics, and I'm looking at the effect of fake news, or what we call misinformation or disinformation, which I'll come on to, the effect of this kind of false information on citizen attitudes and citizen behavior. And so I've especially been looking at the effects during election times. And so I did a lot of research during the 2022 French presidential election, which I'm sure we'll go on to talk about.
Very interesting, Laurence. And so I would start from a very plain question, although rather tricky, if not properly taken care of. Which is, what are we talking about when we talk about fake news? And you mentioned me before this interview that there's a difference between misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. So would you outline the differences and provide us some examples for this?
So, I mean, the first thing to say, and I'm mainly going to talk about elections and election campaigns, but the first thing to say is that false information or lies have always existed in elections, since we started voting for people. So this is really not a new phenomenon, but really since kind of the rise of social media, let's say, and media consumption online, where it's much more difficult to have a control over what's shared in the public debate. And so there's a lot more false information that can have a higher reach. And so this, if we think back to 2016, it was really Trump who kind of, let's say, made popular the term fake news with a series of false claims, mainly aimed at Hillary Clinton, the Democrat candidate at the time. And so since then, we've moved on to really focus on two terms. The first, misinformation, which is false information in the public domain, but making no comment on who is sharing it or where it comes from. Okay, so it's, let's say, agnostic false information. And the second term we use is disinformation. And here it's false information that is shared for a purpose. So either to discredit someone or for an electoral gain. And so this is the second type, type. And so, in fact, there are it's difficult often to separate the two, and there are many examples that we've seen in recent elections. So if I take France in 2022, there was a false rumor about Brigitte Macron, Emmanuel Macron's wife, being a man. So this is clearly a false story. We don't know exactly the origin of it, so maybe we can't say it's disinformation, but we can at least say it's misinformation. And clearly, one of the suspected aims is to make a difference to the election. There are sort of, let's say, one of the things that's difficult to or makes it difficult to really pinpoint misinformation or disinformation is that often they're based on sort of partly true stories, and so they use elements of truth mixed in with falsehoods to kind of make an effect. And so, of course, as we know, there's a large network of fact checkers who are working to kind of debunk, let's say, or show which kinds of information might be false. And at the beginning, fact checkers, they were often saying, well, this is true or this is false. And actually things have become a bit more nuanced today, where now fact checkers, they use often a scale from extremely false to extremely true. And a lot of the claims that they fact check are sort of in the middle. So I would say these are the definitions, but it's very difficult to often to pinpoint what is really true and what is really false.
So you're claiming that, first of all, there has been a change in the diffusion of news in general and information that has caused also the technology of disinformation and misinformation to change. And so we had a first example of it from the 2016 elections in the United States. And then you provided us with a very salient example of it. My question then would be, has it become more difficult for scholars to disentangle the truth from the reality of facts or for what is being said? And do you think that this is also because producing fake news is somehow a dynamic activity that has adapted to the fact that fact checkers have emerged as a more professional and more well-defined role in society?
Yeah. So absolutely. I mean, I think, like always, when it has been difficult to separate truth from false, especially in politics, which is really a domain of opinion. So I think it has always been difficult and continues to be difficult for scholars. And then in terms of the kind of increased sophistication of the creation of of misinformation or false information, yes, absolutely. I think we start to see a more advanced tactics, more nuanced misinformation campaigns, and of course, you touched on technology being one of the reasons behind the kind of the spread of this kind of information. But we're starting to see technology also used to improve the, let's say, effectiveness of this kind of false information. So I'm really thinking about AI here and deep fakes. So this is really where AI meets disinformation. And so we saw last year in the US, during one of the primaries, I think in New Hampshire, and there was a kind of a robocall, so a fake phone call of Joe Biden's voice, which left phone messages for Americans telling them not to vote and telling them not to bother to go out to vote. So here you can see, I mean, how this kind of tactic can also could be very convincing, because I mean, if you listen to the audio, it really sounds like Biden. And we saw a similar examples recently in the past few months in the UK, just before the beginning of the election, which showed Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition, an audio showing him falsely to be shouting at his members of staff, and also a video, and this time a video, which shows him kind of selling kind of a pyramid scheme, you know, like a fraudulent investment scheme to people. So I think we're at the beginning of this now, and we're starting to see how technology can really give more energy and give more power to this kind of information in the public domain.
So you agree with me on the point that the evolution of technology is now playing a substantial role in the effectiveness of fake news. So speaking not only of the quality in the sense of the credibility of the fake news, but also thinking of the target that they aim at. So do you think that there's a heterogeneity in awareness and beliefs regarding the credibility of certain sources from which often fake news come from? And do you think that this heterogeneity can be seen from a demographic perspective, in an age heterogeneity, in a cultural heterogeneity?
So the first thing to say is that there are many, like different kinds of true information, there's many different kinds of false information. And so we start to see that they follow often the kind of the same narrative. So for example, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's a lot of anti-Ukraine or pro-Russian misinformation that we see in Europe. And in terms of elections in Europe, we see that it's often, let's say, connected to themes on the far right, so anti-immigration, anti-Europe, these kind of also populist themes, let's say anti-establishment. And these are the kinds of topics that we see that are kind of make up the content of the misinformation during elections. So I can speak from my own research in France in 2022, so during the presidential campaign, and here we tested different kinds of false stories. So these are stories that were independently fact-checked and independently found to be false by different media. And so here it really varies a lot. I mean, overall, I mean, the awareness of the kinds of stories we tested is not more than 20-30%. But in terms of when we ask people what they find to be credible, if they find these stories to be true, I mean, here you see quite marked differences. So false stories about the level of immigration in France being much exaggerated, a lot of people found this to be credible, sort of 60-70% of the French population in a representative survey. And then you have, let's say, less believable stories. So I mentioned this story about Brigitte Macron, and I wish we had tested that. But a similar kind of story was about there was a fake quote attributed to a junior finance minister saying that, well, the French government don't need to act on the rising energy prices because and don't need to support people with that because the French people can just work from home. Okay, and so this was quite obviously, I think people can tell it's kind of a false story, like the story about Brigitte Macron. So here is kind of 15-20% of people found this credible. So I would say, really, in terms of who believes it, I mean, really, the extent people believe it depends on the story. However, we see, so in my work, but also elsewhere, that we're more likely to believe false stories if it conforms with our existing political views. So I mentioned false stories that play on or use of far-right themes or narratives. Well, people on the right are much more likely to believe these kinds of stories, so they're more susceptible. And also in my own research, I found that, in fact, younger people are more likely to believe. And so this is somewhat surprising, because I think we often talk, and especially in the US, they talk about older people, retired people, believing more in the false stories. And then it's often the kind of less educated and lower earners as well, who from in the data I have, are more likely to believe the false stories we tested. So this is kind of specific stories, but then there's one big topic during elections, which is the integrity of elections also. And so, of course, we've seen in the last two presidential elections in the US, and especially 2022, great numbers of people who doubt the integrity of the election, who feel that votes weren't counted properly, that there were illegal votes cast. I mean, just after Biden's victory was announced in 2020, 60% of Trump supporters felt that, in fact, Trump had actually won, and it wasn't a free and fair election. So you can see almost the effect of what are false stories about the scale of voter fraud on people's opinions. And so going into the election later this year in the States, there's also great numbers of people who are worried about the integrity of that election, and also who are worried that it will be challenged, whatever the result. And in Europe, we're seeing the same thing. So today, we're speaking a few days before the European elections, and 8 in 10 Europeans surveyed last year for the Eurobarometer survey are worried about the influence of disinformation on the election, and in particular worried about the influence of misinformation on the voting decision and on the results of the election. And I think maybe we'll go on to talk about this in terms of how valid their worries are.
So you raised a few interesting points. I would say, first of all, it's surprising to get to know that it's actually often younger people that get more involved into believing in this kind of false information. And if you could maybe elaborate on that a bit more. And then second, I wanted to ask you, do you think that false stories tend to reinforce pre-existing prejudices, such as, for instance, believing in that Brigitte Macron is a man, comes from reinforces the misogynistic view of individuals that do not accept, for instance, maybe that a woman can be the wife of the president and be so important and relevant to the public sphere. So in general, that the introduction of fake news tends to be shaped in order to make more acute the already distorted beliefs, distorted in the sense of being unrealistic. There is also a kind of fake news or disinformation that is created that you have noticed in your studies that is actually aimed at creating new groups of beliefs, such as I would come with an example, which is that of the story of Canon in the US, which is a whole story about how the United States are basically controlled by a clan of well, I cannot say exactly what they are defined, but very shady individuals that do horrible things, and they manipulate the elections, the financial system, and the whole society in order to maintain their hegemony. And this is something that has been created from scratch, and has become one of the key beliefs of Trump supporters, especially the most extreme ones. And so, do you think that there is a difference between the kind of fake news that goes reinforcing pre-existing beliefs and one that creates new beliefs, such as canon theory that has created a whole new world of suspicion and disinformation?
Mm-hmm. So I'll just start with the younger people. So I should say this is what I see from the studies I've done in France, and it's not by no means a general finding that younger people are more susceptible to false information. But I think, as I said, it depends on the kinds of stories, and also. So to explain perhaps why some younger people for certain stories, well, there's first the kinds of media they consume. So if you're more using TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, etc., where there's less quality controls perhaps on the information you see, so you could be exposed to more false information. And secondly, also thinking about this kind of social media and how it's used. I mean, we know from studies in psychology that one of the reasons for increased belief in disinformation is in fact inattention. So really not really paying attention to what the information we're consuming, and let's say taking it at face value. And in fact, of course, inattention is really huge if we think about people scrolling through different news feeds on the social media. So this is how perhaps I would think about this result. So secondly, I mean, this kind of reinforcing existing beliefs versus creating new beliefs. I mean, I think so. One of the things, in fact, this kind of new beliefs you were saying is this kind of, let's say, a new world order and controlling things behind the scenes. I mean, one thing that we see in the kinds of misinformation stories is that they try to offer simple explanations, okay, to people that appeal to people and that people can let's say get behind quite easily. So in this sense, I think there is perhaps some scope for creating new beliefs. But in fact, this tension between existing and new beliefs is really one of the main research questions of my work, and I was really interested in to what extent misinformation manipulates people's voting decisions. So, is it strong enough to convince someone to vote in a way that they otherwise wouldn't? So. In the US, we see, in fact, that despite bigger worries about the effect of misinformation on voting, we see really in the few academic studies there are null effects on the effect of misinformation on voting decisions. So this is partly, I think, because in the US it's already a very polarized situation. So the, let's say, pro-Trump or anti-Clinton misinformation is unlikely, and in fact was not shown to increase voting for Trump or to convince Democrats to go over to Trump. And so in Europe, it's a different situation in that the false information is different. So as I mentioned, it's more connected to far right or populist themes, and here we do see some effects. So there are studies in France and Germany in the respective 2017 elections there, so the German federal election and the French presidential election. And here we see that misinformation does increase voting intention for far-right populist parties, so the AfD in Germany and Marine Le Pen in France. And there's also a study from the 2018 Italian general election, which shows that, so this is in the two northern regions, Bolzano and
perhaps Trento.
Trento, yes, thank you.
Yes,
next door, and they show that exposure to false information, and in fact, likes on Facebook increase votes by a smaller but significant amount for the two populist parties who are the Five Star Movement and Lega, I think. So here we see some effects in Europe. But it's not clear really from this data if this is a case of strengthening views. So people already on the right, let's say, being even more stronger about their views, or even more certain about voting of the far right, or really manipulating people who, let's say, on the left or in the center, or who are unsure about who to vote for. So the evidence there is mixed. And then I should say that to mention my research, again, in the 2022 French presidential election. So here I tested the effect of some far-right misinformation that we saw during the campaign on voting intention. And so here, I don't see an increase in voting intention for the far-right candidates. So was also Marine Le Pen and Eric Zemmour. But in fact, I see an increase in support for the centrist candidates, so especially for Emmanuel Macron, and also for the Green Party leader, Yannick Jadot, who, whilst the Green Party are a left-wing party, could be considered to be a centrist candidate at that election. And so here it's quite paradoxical, but really I think it's explained by two things. The first being that we talk about misinformation campaigns, disinformation, and we focus mainly on it being false. But one of the other aspects is that it's often negative information. So it's pessimistic about the state of the country. It's very critical about the incumbent government. It's really kind of scaremongering about policies, about the influx of migrants, etc. And so we know that negative information can backfire because it makes people feel uneasy, and so it can backfire for the party that's sharing this information. So this might be what we see in my research in 2022, in that this far-right misinformation backfires for the far-right and creates more support for the centrist or establishment candidates. And the second reason, possible explanation, is that this election, it came just 2 months after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and so this is really a period of acute crisis in Europe, but in France as a leading country in Europe. And of course, this is just after the huger crisis of COVID. And so in these periods of crisis, we know that there's this kind of what's called a rally around the flag effect, where they move towards political leaders with experience. And this is what we might also say is an unintended effect of misinformation campaigns for far-right parties during periods of crisis. And so one of the key learnings I have, in fact, from my research and from looking at others who have conducted similar studies, is that it's difficult to pin down a kind of a general or definite effect of misinformation on voting intentions. The context is very important, and in particular, the kinds of misinformation that are shared and that are shared to kind of influence people are also important. And so it also highlights one of the limits to this kind of strategies for far right or populist parties.
So you made I would say several points, but I would like to pick up one specifically, which is that of the evidence of the effect of fake news on electoral political outcomes. And if we find very often no effect in the US, there's basically, you're saying, established evidence finding very little effects, then why bothering with detecting fake news, discussing fake news, if there are some sort of I would say outlier of information that is not correct, but then doesn't affect I would say crucially the dynamics of politics and the debate and even political outcomes. Why bothering with that?
I mean, I think it's important because we want to have or to be in a situation where citizens are informed. False information or falsehoods, we can say, are a bad thing, and it's not something we would like in the public debate. So I think, and it's good to also teach people about how to identify facts from fiction, and of course this is how we progress as a society. I mean, we use facts to help us moving on. Having said that, I mean, speaking for myself, I think this issue is somewhat overblown and somewhat over-exaggerated, and partly in the media we see how it's treated as being a big issue and a decider of elections, and this is kind of the received wisdom about misinformation, but in the academic literature it's not necessarily what we see. If we do see some effects on voting, this doesn't necessarily lead to a change in the result of an election. And so I think we should somewhat take stock a bit and be perhaps a bit more realistic about this genuine threat it poses, which I think is not as big as we say. However, having said this, maybe things will move on. I mentioned AI generated disinformation or deep fakes, and so this may change things. And one of the other reasons we need to be, I think, a bit careful about not making it a bigger issue than it is, or scaremongering, is that for politicians and for public institutions, it's very important, I think, for them not to play the role of sort of arbiters of the truth. And so we should, recognize that in politics, in fact, there is not one truth, and people can have different ideas about how they think things should be. And so it's a slippery slope, I would say, if we focus too much on falsehoods and truthhoods in politics.
So I think that with your last line, you opened up a very difficult question, which is somehow a moral perspective. So in a free society, such as the one where we think we find ourselves, should we allow people to express their views, even when they are not based on facts, but on, I would say, false information? And what do you think about it? And do you think that there is a threshold that should be looked at as somehow a red line beyond which it is dangerous to let people go completely free and say anything on Brigitte Macron's identity, or people should just be free to say whatever they feel like. And let me hint you a point on this question, which is very broad, regarding the fact that whenever information is produced and diffused, there is a social responsibility underlying this process.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think people should be free to speak up to a point, and so I think there is a red line, and this exists already in legislation in different countries. So, of course, the what's over the line is what's dangerous information and harmful information. And so really the discussion is about how do we define together what's dangerous and what's harmful. So I think of course this story about Brigitte Macron is slanderous and uncomfortable, but I don't know that it can be banned in that it's not let's say dangerous. I don't think as harmful as it is. So I think and I don't know exactly the policy here, but I think it's something for each case to be evaluated. But absolutely, I think there's some information that cannot be that shouldn't be allowed to be diffused. But I think, and as I mentioned, I think in politics it's different because it's difficult because so much is based on opinion. And so it becomes difficult really to, let's say, fact check or to say that some things are certainly false. And also we know that, politicians have started, and so Trump also was sort of a pioneer with this, of calling things fake news, the things they don't agree with. And so this term can also be weaponized to kind of disregard genuine criticisms or genuine information that we don't agree with. So it's another way that the use of the term and this is problematic, actually, or can be problematic.
But so don't you think that do you agree with me that the point of considering the social consequences of fake news is a very important way to assess whether it is a harmful situation or somehow an innocuous spread of false beliefs?
Yeah.
So let me give you an example. So you say that Brigitte Macron is a woman. From a moral perspective, it can be seen as it's fake news. It's not true. It's a woman. She's a man. Sorry. You can say that it's fake news. You can claim that it has some repercussions on the political beliefs, but at the same time, it doesn't call, for instance, for outright violence against Brigitte Macron. For instance, spreading fake news, saying tomorrow the state will take away from us $1,000 from our bank's account, to go on the streets and burn the cars. It has very different implications. And I'm taking this somehow extreme comparison between taking stock of probably also already existing beliefs in misogynistic beliefs of people to target also through satire a politically relevant personality against something like the March on Capitol Hill, which was mostly based on the claim that the elections were stolen. Yeah, so
Yeah,
how do you tackle differently these matters, right? But at the same time, and let me pose a question that links the two facts. If you allow for people to spread small misinformation, then this small misinformation can compound to I would say, a huge avalanche of a landslide of misinformation that then can cause the situations like in Capitol Hill that happened in January 21. And so, how do you find the line with having this problem of, I would say, compound beliefs?
So, I mean, it's tricky. I mean, I should say I'm probably not qualified to decide here with you which information should be accepted, should be not accepted. And I think it's more a role for legislators. But absolutely, I mean, one of the problematic things is that often if you talk about this snowball, well, you don't really know where it's going to lead to. I mean, I don't think we imagined that this would happen in the 6th of January in the Capitol Hill. I mean, it also went very, very quickly. So I think really, rather than get bogged down in what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, I think one of the best things to do is to make genuine information, practical information, useful information, to make this information compelling and accessible for people, and to increase trust in reputable sources and in media that are producing genuine information. I think this is really where the focus should be from my perspective.
So, leading us to our last question, our last point of our talk, which is how do you combat misinformation practically, and what kind of policies can be undertaken to mitigate the effect of misinformation?
Mm-hmm. So in terms of on a, let's say, a systematic level, I mean, in terms of legislation, the EU, they released or launched last year the Digital Services Act, which is essentially provides rules and responsibilities for the online platforms to identify and remove false and especially harmful information, and to ensure that they have sufficient teams of fact checkers during election times, etc. And so this is one initiative that is welcome, I think, and requires the support of the online platforms, which is, as I mentioned, although we don't have time now, but you don't only see, of course, false information on online media, but it's, let's say, one of the biggest issues. So this is one thing. And then other initiatives are, of course, fact checks, which help people to find out for themselves how true certain claims are. Now, the effectiveness of fact checks is not always positive, but this is one thing. We also see, if I think to online platforms, they have these kind of labels showing people what might be considered to be false or not. So again, helping individuals to spot false information. And then I think the main intervention, and this is more long-term, is media literacy. And so teaching people about how statistics can be misrepresented, teaching people to spot manipulative tactics in messaging, in campaigns. This, I think, is really the key. And so in Finland, they launched a few years ago a very big program of media literacy. So in schools, but also for adults and for workers. And so they consistently come top or bottom, I can't remember, but of an index about susceptibility to disinformation. So I think this is a long-term intervention, but really the most promising.
So you would agree with me, perhaps, that what somehow would be the greatest antidote to the spread of disinformation is actually common sense. But the problem being about common sense is that it's not very common.
We could say that, yeah.
So I would say that we have already faced several topics and issues. So we don't want to burden the listener with too much information to process. So I think that for today we are done. I'm very grateful for your intervention, Laurence. It's been a very interesting talk. You gave us a fresh perspective on a highly debated topic, and I would say that somehow there's a very recent quote that I read about big data. Big data is like sex. Everybody talks about it, but nobody really knows what it is. And I think that a similar definition could apply to fake news. Everybody talks about them, especially in electoral times, but very few people really know what's going on. And I think that we are lucky enough that you are one of these few people that really dedicate their work and their efforts to understand the multifaceted and complex nature of fake news. And so I want to thank you on behalf of me, but also of Liberi Oltre, to have joined us for this talk. And I want to ask you one closing question. Just as what do you think that fake news might play a crucial role in the incoming European Parliament elections, given the high tension that is going through Europe because of I would say several lines of conflict in society?
So I know there's a team at the European Commission who follow very closely the narratives that we see in Europe, and so I think they would know more than me the scale of the false information that we're seeing. But I would say, based on recent research, that I'm not sure that this information will necessarily have huge impacts on voting. But you know, I don't have any data to show you on that. So.
Well, I thank you for your honesty. Not everyone, some people would have profited of the occasion to just tell us some sort of truth, and any reference to a self-founded social media platform is not random. And so thank you very much for your time, Laurence, and good luck with the rest of your research. And we look forward to if you have empirical developments and new observations or theories that you develop in the next coming months, we will be happy to talk about them.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Yes. Bye.